knights in shining armour, Anglo-Saxons in mail hauberks, legionaries in lorica segmentata, and hoplites in linothorax or muscle cuirass. We are all familiar with European historical armour, so much so that the sight of specific styles today immediately brings to mind the era that they belong to and the fighting styles, the tactics, the ethos of the warriors, and even the entire society that the wearers came from. But when did metal armour first emerge in Europe? Where was it first developed? What about the first metal helmets and shields? And what can all this armour tell us about its users and the societies that they came from? This is the story of European Bronze Age armour. The use of organic armour, that is wood, leather, bone and so on, has been seen in many cultures around the world. It was surely used extensively in prehistoric Europe too, although almost none of it has survived. There is evidence for wooden shields covered with rawhide, and one example of a helmet made of spliced branches of spruce. Small branches of viburnum were wrapped in spirals around them and secured with reed and finished with a leather cover. The boar's tusk helmets of Mycenaean Greece are famous, but boar's tusks were also used for helmets in Switzerland, and boar's tusk plates were also incorporated in armour on the Eurasian steppe in the late Neolithic and early Copper Age. From perhaps as early as 1700 BC, but certainly by 1500 BC, metal armour began to be incorporated into existing organic armour systems. There is a relatively large amount of surviving armour, including fragments of armour, from later historical periods. Some individual museums have hundreds of pieces of medieval armour. But from the Bronze Age, there are just 71 helmets known from Eastern Europe and 52 from Western Europe, and 31 cuirasses, that's the large plates covering the chest and back, and 78 greaves, which protect the shins, from all of Europe, which isn't a lot, considering we're looking at a huge area over about 1,000 years. And analysis of these Bronze Age pieces is difficult, because many derive from illegal or very old excavations. Many have no known find spot or context, or are in private collections rather than museums or other public institutions. There are nevertheless clear patterns in distribution across Europe, and what we have today depends on what was put in the ground thousands of years ago. For example, in Britain and Ireland, they like to put bronze shields into wet places, but no other kind of armour is found there, despite there being reasons to believe it was in wide usage. And in the rest of Europe, almost no shields at all seem to have been deposited anywhere, despite the fact that they are displayed in contemporary art. The late Bronze Age in Central Europe was dominated by what's called the urnfield tradition. This was a kind of burial practice that evolved from about 1300 BC and spread widely, where people were cremated and their remains placed in urns and buried in cemeteries or fields, hence the name urnfield. So for many centuries there was no tradition of burying a chief in his magnificent war gear, unfortunately. But it was different in Mycenaean Greece. There were tombs where elite people were buried that have preserved some incredible artifacts. The famous grave at Dendra is the only burial where a complete assemblage of metal body armour has ever been found, which contained a greave, the unique panoply, and a boar's tusk helmet with bronze cheek plates, whilst the body was probably also covered by a wooden shield. We'll talk more about the Dendra Panoply later. There is other evidence from the Bronze Age too, in the form of the Linear B script from Mycenaean Greece that records some interesting bits of information about armour and warfare. And there is artwork from the Aegean in palace frescoes and on pottery and metal objects. From the rest of Europe, there is rock art in Scandinavia and Iberia depicting warriors and some of their gear. There are bronze figurines in armour from Sardinia, and stone statues on Corsica indicating armour styles, and a handful of other finds from throughout Europe, like engraved razors and small stone figures with more hints. Archaeologists have spent decades analysing and categorising this evidence into specific types and subtypes and establishing chronologies, though of course debate rages on. So I'm going to talk about bronze helmets, greaves, shields, other kinds of armour, and then cuirasses. First, let's talk about the metal helmets of Bronze Age Europe. There are about 120 surviving metal helmets from the European Bronze Age, and they're classified into two main types according to their manufacture, distribution and appearance. Class 1 comprises helmets made of one metal sheet beaten into a round or conical cap. Most of these had a knob brazed to the top for attaching an organic plume of feathers or horsehair or perhaps other magnificent things. And Class 2 comprises helmets made of two metal sheets secured together, often with a crested cap. So there were two main construction methods. The main types have been further subdivided into more detailed classifications that we won't get into, but for centuries during the late Bronze Age there were basically two traditions. In Western Europe they made the crested helmets, and in Eastern Europe they made cap helmets. It is believed both types developed independently from organic helmet precursors. The Eastern style seems to have been an Aegean development, and the West European one arose from local traditions. The oldest European helmets are found in the Aegean, and this early example is decorated with boar tusk incisions in the same pattern as an actual boar's tusk helmet. This demonstrates that it's a transitional form emerging from the boar's tusk helmet tradition of Mycenaean Greece. The boar's tusk helm from Dendra has metal cheek plates that match those on this earliest metal helm type, again reinforcing their relationship in time. The first metal helmet style probably emerged in the 15th century BC, and then spread north from Greece into the Carpathian Basin, and on even to northern Germany, and this style was still in use as late as the 13th century BC in Eastern Europe. Although there were undoubtedly trade networks between the Aegean and Central Europe, they weren't just produced in Greece and traded north. They were actually constructed in this style in the Carpathian Basin. The Western European helmets seem to have developed independently, fusing two sheets of bronze together and integrating a slight crest that tended to grow over time. By the Iron Age in Italy, centuries later, the crests became enormous and elaborately decorated. But although there were two initial traditions, styles and innovations in arms and armour also spread back and forth throughout Europe during the Bronze Age, from Ireland to Greece and from Sweden to Iberia. The earliest simple helmets of the first class from the Aegean and Eastern Europe might have weighed just 400 grams, while later taller ones of the second class from Western Europe weighed up to 1500 grams, which is about 3.3 pounds. They didn't just become taller and broader, but the bronze was often thicker in the later ones, up to 5mm at the rim and 3mm at the top of the cap. That's quite hefty, and the evidence shows that these later helms developed a thicker organic lining too. All armour is a trade-off between protection and mobility, and part of the story of these helmet style differences might relate to the development of different fighting styles over the centuries. We see a new martial tradition emerge throughout Europe from about 1200 BC. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Some of these helmets show damage from sword blows. One helmet suffered 3 severe blows on one side, and another has 4 almost parallel impressions from repeated sword strikes. Even with an internal lining, that would have hurt. In one of his writings, Aristotle says sponges, as in sea sponges, were used inside helmets and greaves to help cushion blows. This variety was called the sponge of Achilles. Outside of Greece, very few helms have been discovered in graves. Speaking very generally, they seem to have been placed in rivers and bogs in Western Europe, while in Eastern Europe they were more often buried as hoards, meaning it was deposited for safekeeping until it could be dug up again, or as scrap hoards, meaning temporarily buried and intended for recycling, or as votive deposits, as in a sacrificial offering. However, most helmets and other kinds of armour were precious, and were passed from man to man down the generations. In this way, ancient arms and armour obtained their own epic genealogies. They carried their own narratives with them as they were passed from one man's story to another. Each new wearer becomes part of the story and also draws on the power of the armour imparted by its previous owners. There is an interesting example of this from Book 10 of the Iliad. Now, the Iliad and the Odyssey are not Bronze Age works, but there is undoubtedly knowledge of the period contained within them. The fact that Homer describes a boar's tusk helm, which was already an outmoded form of protection by the time of the Trojan War, is one of many story elements later confirmed by archaeology. There are other examples, like the description of Nestor's gold cup, and one just like it found at Mycenaean. So this part of the Iliad is about a boar's tusk helm given to Odysseus, but it reflects the way helmets and other pieces of armour carried their histories with them during their lives. Quote, "Both men harnessed up in the grim gear of war. Thrasymedes, staunch in combat, handed Tydeus' son a two-edged sword, a shield too, and over his head he set a helmet, bull's hide, bare of ridge and crest, a skull cap, so it's called, made to protect the heads of tough, young-blooded fighters. Marianne gave Odysseus bow, quiver, and sword, and over his head he set a helmet made of leather. Inside it was criss-crossed taut with many thongs. Outside, the gleaming teeth of a white-tusked boar ran round and round in rows stitched neat and tight. A master craftsman's work. The cap in its centre padded soft with felt. The wolf himself, Autolycus, lifted that splendid headgear out of Eleon once. He stole it from Ormenus' son Amintor years ago, reaching his sturdy palace walls one night, then passed it on to Amphidamas, Cythera-born, Scandia-bound. Amphidamas gave it to Molus, a guest gift once that Molus gave to Marianne, his son, to wear in battle. And now it encased Odysseus' head, snug around his brows, and so, both harnessed up in the grim gear of war, the two men moved out." End quote. Now let's talk about an element of Bronze Age armour that no right-thinking warrior would want to be without. This is the lower leg protection called Greaves. Greaves were used to protect the lower legs, and they were very important in Bronze Age and classical warfare. You could cover your head with a helmet, and your body with a breastplate and a large shield, but your shins would be vulnerable, and so greaves were developed. They had organic precursors, no doubt made from leather and linen. The earliest metal greaves were shaped more like bronze oval sheets, folded around an organic backing and secured about the calf. Some argue that textual and artistic evidence suggests that in some cases only a single greave was used to protect the leading leg, and some single greaves have been found archaeologically, like at Dendra, which may reinforce this hypothesis. We have about 78 greaves from 42 locations dated to the Bronze Age and early Iron Age in Europe, and apart from the ones at Dendra, all of them are decorated. So greaves were a highly valued element of the late Bronze Age armour system. Homer talks about them a few times in the Iliad. There's the line, "First he wrapped his legs with well-made greaves," and he also says that men would wear linen greaves for walking through the dry, thorny Greek summer countryside. There is no doubt that greaves were used from the Aegean to Central Europe at least, and very likely beyond. Of far less importance were other pieces of armour for arm, hand and shoulder protection. There are pauldrons, which is shoulder armour, known from Dendra, and two more examples from Praesos on Crete. But it seems to have been dropped early on. There is an example from Mycenaean of a hand protector for the sword hand. It has holes that suggest it was attached to an inner lining with an organic band around the wrist. There is another handguard from Eastern Europe that is doubly unusual because it's for a left hand, so presumably this was a left-handed swordsman, but because it's so unusual there is a possibility that it's a forgery. But either way, metal hand protection was technically possible, but it seems it was never that popular. As for arm protection, Homer never mentions it in warfare, although he does say that some farmers wore arm protection when working in the fields. But there have been rectangular bronze sheets with holes along the short edge for attaching to bands found in Hungary, and these would have fitted around the lower arm. On the 12th century BC warrior vase from Mycenaean, the warriors have long sleeves, but whether this is supposed to be clothing or organic or metal armour is unclear. So perhaps Bronze Age Europeans preferred organic arm protection when they used it at all. The best protection for your left arm and for much of the rest of your body, of course, came from shields. The warfare of early Mycenaean Greece relied on the heavy spearman protected by a large figure-of-8 shield, and the boar's tusk helm, of course. These heavily armoured warriors also used a tower shield, a rectangular shape, which might have been the earlier type, with the figure-of-8 shape developing later, although for a time both were employed together. These shields were perhaps made of wickerwork on a wooden frame and faced with one or more layers of ox hide. Sometimes they were reinforced with bronze plates. In the Iliad, Ajax's famous tower shield is said to be 7 layers of ox hide covered with bronze. This is from Book 7 of the Iliad. Quote, Ajax harnessed himself in burnished, gleaming bronze, and once he had strapped his legs and chest in armour, out he marched, like the giant god of battle, wading into the wars of men, when Zeus drives them hard to clash and soldier on with heart-devouring hate. So giant Ajax marched, that bulwark of the Achaeans, a grim smile curling below his dark, shaggy brows, under his legs' power, taking immense strides, shaking his spear high, its long shadow trailing. The men of Argos exulted at the sight of him there, but terrible tremors shook each Trojan fighter's knees. Ajax strode on, closing, bearing his huge body shield like a rampart, heavy bronze over 7 layers of ox hide. End quote. Unfortunately, no physical examples of these shields survive, and they're known mainly from frescoes starting in about 1600 BC. From about 1300 BC, the Mycenaean style of warfare started to change, and the figure-of-8 shield was discontinued, although its image was still used as a decorative motif for centuries. But this was when the Greeks adopted the circular shield design, or circular with a cut-out section, also used by the rest of Europe from this time. There are over 90 known shields dating to the Bronze Age in northern, central and western Europe, of which 86 are made of bronze. They date to about 1300 BC to 800 BC, and the majority have been found in Britain and Ireland, with a handful in southern Scandinavia and northern Germany. They are between 20 centimeters and 80 centimeters in diameter. For reference, the huge round aspis or hoplon of Iron Age ancient Greece was about 90 centimeters or more. These bronze shields were made by meticulous heating and hammering of a smaller, thicker disc of bronze into the final form. Because they are so thin and there is no evidence of a wooden backing, it was long argued that they were purely ceremonial or constructed only to be deposited into a bog. There was a famous experiment carried out in 1962 where a replica shield was easily pierced by a bronze sword, and this was seen as conclusive. But those 1960s archaeologists had used copper for their replica, not bronze. And since then, more original shields have been discovered which show battle damage, and more replicas made of far harder bronze have shown their defensive utility. Actually, these shields took an enormous amount of skill to make, so much so that hardly anyone today has been successful with accurate recreations. The repeated cycles of hammering and heating, or annealing, must be done with immense precision, and additional strength is provided by the shallow bowl shape they have, and by a thicker band around the rim made by adding twisted bronze wire and folding the edge of the sheet over it. A key feature is the sturdy boss, the round bowl shape in the centre. This was also used to deliver blows to an enemy. Although bronze shields aren't found everywhere, they are seen in the rock art of Scandinavia. the funerary stelae of Iberia, and the bronze statuettes of the Nuragic civilization. It's clear that, especially after about 1200 BC, bronze shields were widespread right across Europe, and no doubt many continue to be made from wood and rawhide. Now, let's talk about the development of cuirasses, or corselets, the metal breastplates of the Bronze Age. The excavation of tombs at Dendra in Greece uncovered a full panoply, meaning many pieces forming the full suit of armour, dated to about 1400 BC. From a different grave, they found a bronze shoulder guard called a pauldron, dated to about 1425 BC. The craftsmanship of the pauldron is of a higher quality than the panoply, which shows that the technology was already quite well established by this time. And in fact, there are bits and pieces of bronze sheet metal from earlier sites that have since been identified as elements of plate armour, which extend this technology back to 1500 BC and maybe earlier. Some suggest 1700 BC, when strips and other pieces of bronze were perhaps incorporated in organic armours. All of these early Greek examples add up to no more than 8 suits of armour surviving in the archaeological record so far. But the textual evidence in Linear B suggests there may have been thousands of these early suits of plate armour in existence in the Aegean at any one time. The Dendra Panoply might look cumbersome and even a bit ridiculous, and some scholars have argued that it was unsuitable for combat, and so must have been for parade or display only. A more popular argument is that it was intended for use in chariots only. Another argument is that it can only have been used by infantry, because stepping up and down from chariots was cumbersome or impossible. Another proposal is that they were meant solely for duelling by chiefs and champions. Actually though, accurate reconstructions have shown it is quite possible to do all these things, and even jog and get up if you've been knocked down, and fight in a variety of roles, even shooting a bow and arrow. And although lifting an arm straight up is not possible because of the pauldrons, it is possible to raise your arm enough while using an overarm grip on a spear to deliver a thrust to an enemy's throat. The bronze sheets are under 1mm thick and would have been suspended from leather straps and perhaps other leather backing in certain places. The whole panoply weighs 15 kilograms or 33 pounds and was mobile and versatile enough for many roles, although of course it was heavier and more restrictive than a well-fitted, shorter, more anatomical breastplate. And the forms of these Greek armours changed as fighting styles changed, tending to become ever more simplified with ever fewer and smaller attachments. By 1200 BC, in line with the rest of Europe, they were comprised only of the main corselet or cuirass protecting the chest and back. Comprised of just 2 pieces, these new cuirasses were shorter and sat tighter on the waist and shoulders, and spread across Europe along with the round shield and new weapon types. Because from about 1200 BC, a new martial tradition appeared throughout Europe. Along with armour changes, new sword types were developed, with multiple kinds in use all over Europe, each type suited to specific combat styles. Some swords were better for punching through organic armours, and the new heavy spears might have been designed to puncture bronze shields and even plate armour. Modern testing has shown it could perhaps be done. So the new style of cuirass was constructed from a breastplate and a backplate, joined together in various clever ways around the warrior's abdomen, and they were worn over a leather, wool, felt or textile jerkin that provided additional protection. Some of the pieces of body armour we have today show evidence of repair during their lifetime, which suggests they were used in combat, as if there was any doubt. And others were put into the ground with unrepaired battle damage still on them. This cuirass, for example, was pierced by a sword blade near the collarbone. The blade travelled through the man's body, through his organic armour and clothing, and out the back of the cuirass. A mighty blow like this would surely have brought great fame to the hero who struck it. Perhaps this was the reason for the armour's internment. It was not repaired or recycled, but buried. Was it perhaps the victorious warrior giving thanks for his victory. Despite the examples of damaged cuirasses, of course it provided superior protection than organic armour alone, and this type was in widespread use throughout Europe by the warrior aristocracy, mercenaries, raiders and pirates, and whoever could get their hands on them. It provided this protection while hardly limiting movement at all, and once it had been developed, it didn't change much for centuries. These late Bronze Age warriors wore helms, often with crests or plumes, metal greaves and fitted cuirasses, while carrying round shields. Their groin and thighs might have been protected by a skirt of layered linen or leather, and around their shoulders may have been a cloak, as fine and well coloured as they could afford. In the Iliad, we see the Trojan Paris equip himself for battle. Quote, "And now one warrior harnessed burnished armour on his back, magnificent Paris, fair-haired Helen's consort. First he wrapped his legs with well-made greaves, fastened behind the heels with silver ankle clasps. Next he strapped a breastplate round his chest, his brother Lycaon's that fitted him so well. Then over his shoulder Paris slung his sword, the fine bronze blade with its silver-studded hilt, and then the shield strap, and his sturdy, massive shield, and over his powerful head he set a well-forged helmet, the horsehair crest atop it towering, bristling terror, and last he grasped a spear that matched his grip." End quote. And all the bronze worn by these warriors would surely have been polished to a bright golden shine by their servants and slaves. There are no contemporary accounts of a European late Bronze Age battlefield, but again we do have Homer. This time it's Book 2 of the Iliad that gives a glimpse into what an army might have looked like. Which parts are real reflections of the Bronze Age, and which are Iron Age anachronisms, I will leave up to you. Quote, "Agamemnon commanded heralds to cry out loud and clear, and summon the long-haired Achaean troops to battle. Their cries rang out, the battalions gathered quickly, the warlords dear to the gods, and flanking Agamemnon strode on ahead, marshalling men-at-arms in files. As ravening fire rips through stands of timber high on a mountain ridge, and the blaze flares miles away, so from the marching troops the blaze of bronze armour, splendid and superhuman, flared across the earth, flashing into the air to strike the sky." End quote. If you like these videos, please support the channel on Patreon or by picking up my novels on Amazon. And as always, the sources are in the video description. Now, please watch this video on the horned helmets of the late Bronze Age. It goes really great with this one. Thank you for watching.